Sarah and Paul were the couple everyone admired. Friends and family often looked at them with envy, whispering about how lucky they were to have found each other. Their wedding day had been magical. The happiest day of their lives, filled with laughter, tears of joy, and endless dancing under the glowing lights. Sarah, a beautiful and determined woman, worked as a banker, while Paul was a rising star at a real estate company. They earned well and built a beautiful life together, full of dreams for the future. Their bond grew even stronger when Sarah gave birth to a precious baby girl named Wara. She became the light of their lives, her laughter filling every corner of their home. Watching Paul carry Wara on his shoulders, Sarah often smiled, believing their happiness would last forever. Years passed, and Wara blossomed into a vibrant 9-year-old, full of questions and dreams. Life seemed perfect, until one rainy evening changed everything. Paul returned home earlier than usual, his face pale and his steps heavy. Sarah immediately sensed something was wrong. "What's the matter, love?" she asked, concern deep in her voice. Paul sank into the couch, burying his face in his hands. I was fired today," he said hoarsely. Sarah's heart dropped. "What happened? Why?" He hesitated, struggling with his words. "I don't really know. Last week, the company accountant sent a large sum of money to my account, asking me to keep it safe. I didn't question it. But today, they accused me of misconduct. The accountant was fired too." Sarah's mind raced. "Did you call him? Ask him why?" Paul fumbled for his phone and dialed. After a few rings, the accountant picked up. His voice was filled with guilt. "Paul, I'm sorry. That money, it got both of us fired. I never should have involved you." Paul's hands trembled as he ended the call. Tears welled in his eyes. Why would he drag me into this?" His voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. Sarah sat beside him and pulled him into her arms. "It's okay, my love. We'll get through this. I'll take care of us until you're back on your feet. Don't worry." Paul clung to her tightly, feeling a glimmer of hope in her promise. In the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into her work. Her dedication was noticed, and to her surprise, she was promoted to Deputy General Manager at the bank. She rushed home with the news, her heart bursting with excitement. Paul smiled genuinely for the first time in days. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah." But as life often does, their roles began to shift. Paul, once the provider, now stayed home, cooking, cleaning, bathing Wara, and helping her with homework. Meanwhile, Sarah's world became filled with meetings, deadlines, and endless responsibilities. The cracks began to form silently, like a slow leak behind a beautiful wall. Neither of them realized it, but the perfect love story they had once celebrated was starting to unravel, one painful thread at a time. At first, Paul didn't mind the change. He loved Wara deeply, and spending more time with her made the sting of losing his job easier to bear. Each morning he packed her little lunch, braided her hair as best he could, and walked her proudly to school. In the evenings they laughed over homework and played silly games in the living room while waiting for Sarah to return. But over time, something inside Sarah shifted. The woman who once clung to Paul's arm and whispered sweet promises now barely looked at him. She would walk in, toss her handbag carelessly on the chair, and sigh heavily, as though the sight of him annoyed her. Her words, once soft and filled with love, turned sharp and heavy like stones hurled at his chest. "Lazy man," she muttered one evening when Paul offered to serve her dinner. "You've gotten too comfortable doing nothing." Paul's heart sank. He wanted to defend himself, to remind her that he was trying, applying for jobs every day, even attending interviews. But he bit his tongue, swallowing the hurt, praying she was just tired. Then came the day everything cracked wide open. Paul had been on his laptop, painstakingly filling out another job application. Time slipped away from him, and before he knew it, it was already past 5 p.m. The time to pick up Wara. Panicked, he shut the laptop and raced to the school. When he got home, Wura holding his hand tightly, Sarah was standing at the door. Her face was a storm, brewing with rage. "What took you so long?" she screamed, her voice cutting through the quiet evening. Before Paul could utter a word, a sharp slap landed across his cheek, right there in front of their daughter. Wura gasped and clung tighter to Paul's leg, her little eyes wide with fear. Tears pricked the corners of Paul's eyes, but he quickly masked his pain, kneeling to comfort Wura. "It's okay, princess," he whispered. "Go to your room." After Wura hurried away, Sarah stood glaring, her chest heaving. "You're useless," she spat. "A real man would have found something to do by now." Paul clenched his fists, trembling. His voice shook as he finally spoke. "Sarah, why are you doing this? I'm not lazy. I'm trying every day. It's just not easy." Sarah scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Paul standing there, wounded and alone. That night, as Paul stirred a pot of rice in the kitchen, trying to help prepare dinner, Wura stood quietly beside him. Without warning, Sarah stormed in again, slapped him even harder, and cursed him under her breath. Paul blinked back tears, forcing a smile for Wura's sake. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "go back to your room." Alone in the kitchen, Paul leaned against the counter, his heart breaking into pieces. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing the woman he loved, the family he had fought so hard to protect. And he didn't know how much longer he could survive it. The days dragged by, painfully slow for Paul. Each morning he woke up to the cold silence between him and Sarah. Each night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when, or if, things would ever get better. Still, he kept trying. Paul continued to submit his CV to companies, praying for a breakthrough. But every rejection email that came stung harder than the last. And Sarah's attitude only grew colder, harsher. It wasn't just words now. It was the way she looked at him, like he was a burden she could hardly bear. One evening, as Paul was helping Wura with her math homework, Sarah burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. "Paul," she called out, almost breathless. "Guess what?" Paul looked up, hopeful for a moment that maybe, just maybe, this was good news for both of them. "What is it?" "I've been promoted again," she beamed. "General Manage. The bank's MD even congratulated me personally." Paul forced a smile and stood up to hug her. "That's amazing, Sarah. I'm proud of you." For a moment, they embraced, and it felt almost like old times. But it was fleeting. The next words from Sarah's mouth wiped away whatever warmth remained. "And they want to come to our house," she said, stepping back, "this weekend, to know me better, to celebrate. The MD, his wife, and their son." Paul froze. Their house. Their broken home. He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll prepare. I'll make sure everything is perfect." Sarah barely acknowledged his response before disappearing into the bedroom, already on the phone bragging to a friend about her success. The rest of the week, Paul worked tirelessly. He cleaned every corner of the house, fixed small things he had long ignored, even bought fresh flowers to decorate the living room. He wanted Sarah to be proud, to show her he still had value, even if he wasn't wearing a suit and tie anymore. Saturday arrived. The house gleamed. Paul wore his best shirt. Wura wore a beautiful gown he had ironed himself. Sarah looked stunning in a fitted dress, her makeup flawless. When the MD, Mr. John, arrived with his wife and young son, the air was thick with polite greetings and fake smiles. Paul served drinks and snacks, while Wura shyly clung to his side. But then, as the adults sat chatting, something happened that no one could have expected. Mr. John's son stormed into the living room, tears streaming down his face. "Daddy, Wura slapped me." The room, fell into stunned silence. Mr. John turned to Wura, frowning. "Wura, why would you do that?" Wura, her small voice trembling, looked straight at him and said, "Because that's what Mummy does. Mummy slaps Daddy all the time, and Daddy doesn't say anything." The words dropped like a bomb in the room. Paul's heart shattered. Sarah's face turned pale. Mr. Johns's expression hardened, and his wife gasped in horror. For the first time, the ugly truth Sarah had hidden so well began to crawl into the light. And nothing would ever be the same again. The room was frozen in stunned silence. Sarah sat stiffly, her hands trembling slightly on her lap. Paul felt as if the world had stopped spinning, the walls closing in, and little Wura, clutching the hem of her dress, stared around the room, confused by the tension she had unknowingly unleashed. Mr. John cleared his throat, his voice low but heavy with judgment. "Sarah," he began, his piercing eyes narrowing. "Is this true?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stared at the floor, her cheeks burning with shame. Mr. John shook his head slowly. "I came here thinking I was celebrating a hard-working, noble woman, but what I see is pride and cruelty." He stood, towering over the room. His wife rose too, her face tight with disapproval. "You think a good career justifies destroying your family?" Mr. John's voice cracked with anger. "You humiliate your husband, a man who once stood tall for you, just because he's struggling now? Is this the strength you're proud of?" Sarah's lips trembled. I've been the one providing. I was tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Jones scoffed. "Tired? You forgot your vows, Sarah. Marriage is not only for good times. It's about standing together through storms. You crushed the man who once built a future for you, and worse, you taught your daughter that this is love." Paul sat frozen, blinking rapidly to hold back the flood of emotions. "And you?" Mr. John turned to Paul, softening slightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "You don't deserve this humiliation, Paul. I have friends in real estate, powerful friends. I'll help you find something better. You deserve another chance." Paul stared at the card like it was a lifeline tossed into a drowning sea. Without waiting for another word, Mr. John ushered his wife and son toward the door. He paused at the threshold, giving Sarah one last look, a mixture of pity and disappointment. "Fix your home," he said, coldly, "before you lose it all." And then they were gone. The door clicked shut, and silence fell over the house like a heavy curtain. Paul sat back heavily in his chair, the card trembling in his hand. Tears he could no longer hold back rolled down his cheeks. Sarah slowly sank to her knees in front of him, her pride shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, gripping the fabric of his trousers. "Paul, please forgive me. I lost myself. I didn't realize how much pain I caused." Wura peeked from the hallway, her eyes wide and fearful. Paul looked down at the woman who once promised to love him through anything. His heart was torn between anger and pity, love and betrayal. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a trembling hand, he pulled Sarah into a hug. Wura ran over, wrapping her little arms around them both, crying. It was messy, it was painful, but somehow, it was a beginning. "Then, pull position. What will you do?" The following morning, the air in the house was different. It was quieter, but not the heavy, cold silence of the past few months. This silence was softer, almost fragile, like a deep breath after a storm. Sarah moved carefully around Paul, her eyes always searching his face for any sign of anger or resentment. Paul, meanwhile, was lost in thought. The card Mr. John had given him sat on the table, staring back like a beacon of hope he was almost afraid to reach for. Finally, after hours of pacing, Paul picked up his phone and dialed the number. The call connected on the second ring. "Hello?" a deep, confident voice answered. "Good morning, sir. This is Paul, Mr. John's friend," Paul said, his voice shaking slightly. "Ah, yes. Mr. John told me about you," the man said warmly. "Come by my office tomorrow. Let's talk." Paul could hardly believe it. After months of closed doors and bitter tears, one door had finally creaked open. When he ended the call, he turned to find Sarah standing there, twisting her hands nervously. "Paul," she said hesitantly, "whatever happens, just know I believe in you. I'm sorry for everything." Paul nodded, his heart a mix of emotions. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm doing this for us, for Wura." The next morning, Paul wore his best outfit, the same suit he had worn years ago when he first landed his real estate job. It was a little tighter now, but it carried memories of better days, and that was enough. Sarah stood by the door as he left, Wura clutching his hand tightly. "You can do it, Daddy," Wura cheered. Paul smiled, kissed her forehead, and stepped out, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The meeting went better than he could have dreamed. Mr. Johnson, the CEO of one of the biggest real estate companies in the city, was impressed with Paul's experience and character. "We need honest men like you," Mr. Johnson said, handing him a formal letter. "Welcome to the team, Paul. Your salary starts higher than your previous job. I trust you'll make us proud." Paul blinked, barely able to process the words. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." When he got home, he found Sarah and Wura waiting anxiously by the window. The moment Paul stepped out of the taxi, waving the appointment letter in his hand, Sarah burst into tears. Wura ran to him first, jumping into his arms. "Daddy did it," she squealed. Sarah followed, her face wet with tears. She threw her arms around him, whispering, "I'm proud of you. I'm so sorry for everything." Paul held them both tightly, feeling the heavy weight in his chest lift for the first time in months. That night they sat together for dinner. Not in cold silence, but in laughter and stories. It was a slow healing, but it was real. And as Paul tucked Wura into bed later that night, she whispered, "Daddy, you're my hero." Paul smiled through misty eyes. Maybe the storm had passed after all. Paul threw himself into his new job with a passion that amazed everyone around him. Within weeks, he was one of the top agents in the company, closing deals, earning respect, and rebuilding the confidence that had once been crushed under the weight of shame and disappointment. Each morning, he kissed Sarah and Wura goodbye with a real smile, carrying the hope of better days in his chest. Each evening, he came home with stories of his growing successes, and Wura would sit on his lap, wide-eyed, listening to her father talk about skyscrapers and dream homes. Sarah, too, had changed. No longer did she return home with bitterness dripping from her tongue. Instead, she made sure dinner was ready, the house was clean, and there was laughter, real laughter, back in their home. It wasn't perfect. Healing never is. There were nights when they argued about little things, nights when Sarah would catch herself raising her voice before quickly pulling back. But the difference now was that they were trying. Both of them. 6 months into Paul's new job, a miracle happened. One evening, Paul drove home later than usual, parking a brand new white SUV in the driveway. A gift from the company for being their highest earner that quarter. The engine purred like a lion as he stepped out, grinning from ear to ear. Sarah and Wura rushed outside, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. "You bought a new car?" Sarah gasped. Paul laughed. "The company did, technically, but that's not all." He pulled a sleek envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Sarah. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, and gasped again. It was a deed to a new house, a beautiful, spacious house in a serene estate. a place where Wura could have her own room, where Sarah could design her dream kitchen, where they could start fresh. Away from the memories of pain and failure. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She looked up at Paul, her lips quivering. "You did all this? For us?" she whispered. Paul nodded, emotion choking his words. "For you, for Wura, for everything we almost lost." Wura screamed with excitement, throwing herself into her father's arms. Sarah followed, wrapping her arms around both of them as sobs racked her body. They stood there in the driveway, a small family wrapped in love and redemption under the warm orange glow of the setting sun. For the first time in a long, long time, Sarah felt truly safe, truly loved. And Paul felt seen again, no longer invisible in his own home. As they posed for a photo in front of their new car, Wura shouted, "Say cheese." Paul laughed, pulling Sarah close. "No," he said, "say new beginnings." And together they shouted it into the evening air. A family reborn from the ashes. The new house stood like a promise at the edge of a quiet, beautiful neighborhood. White walls gleaming under the sun, a small garden blooming with colorful flowers out front. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything they had survived. The day they moved in, Paul lifted Wura onto his shoulders and spun her around, her giggles filling the air. Sarah stood at the doorstep, a box in her arms, tears streaming down her face. But this time they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. Inside, everything smelled new, fresh paint, polished wood floors, and hope. Paul had carefully chosen every detail with his family in mind. Wura's room painted in soft pink and white, Sarah's dream kitchen gleaming with marble countertops, and a cozy living room with wide windows where they could sit together and watch the sunsets. That first night, after Wura had fallen asleep, Sarah and Paul sat on the floor of the empty living room, a bottle of wine between them, laughter breaking out from stories they hadn't shared in years. "You know," Sarah said, playing with the rim of her glass, "there were days I thought we would never smile together again." Paul looked at her, his heart heavy and light at the same time. "There were days," he said quietly, "I thought I would lose you completely." Sarah set her glass down and crawled into his lap like she used to when they were younger. "I'm sorry for everything, Paul. For the way I treated you, for forgetting who we were." Paul stroked her hair gently. "We both forgot," he whispered. "But we found our way back." The clock ticked softly, the world outside their windows quiet and still. They didn't need expensive vacations or grand parties to feel rich. Sitting there, in an empty room filled with forgiveness and love, they were the wealthiest people alive. Weeks passed, and laughter became a permanent guest in their home again. Wura invited her new friends over, proudly showing them her princess room. Sarah took up baking on weekends, her laughter filling the kitchen as Paul pretended to be her official taste tester. One Sunday afternoon they stood together in the backyard, admiring the small garden Paul had planted. Sarah leaned into him and said, This is all I ever wanted." Paul smiled, pulling her closer. "It's just the beginning, love." They watched Wura chasing butterflies, her laughter mingling with the gentle breeze. The scars they bore were real, but they had healed together, stronger and wiser. Life would still have its storms, they knew that, but now they had learned how to hold each other through the rain. In the golden light of the setting sun, with their daughter's laughter ringing in their ears and their hearts stitched back together by love and forgiveness, Paul and Sarah knew one truth for certain. They were home, and no storm could ever take that away again. If you are in Paul's position, will you forgive Sarah? Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and tell us where you are watching us from.